Yeah, good evening, dear conference participants.
Good evening. So it's time to start the session. We have 3 speakers available online, and of course the respondents. So we're looking for Leye Komolafe, Zinleka Uluse, and then Adeoluoye Kon. So those 3.
Okay, I'm sure Dr. Oyekon is coming on very soon because we spoke not quite 10 minutes ago. Okay. So I'm sure it's coming on.
All right, so we can go ahead, man, the chair.
Okay. We don't want to wait for 1 or 2 minutes.
Yeah, the session started already.
Sorry, Chair. Okay. I spoke to Zinche about an hour ago. She said she's not feeling well. I thought she had communicated with the chair, but she can't make it.
Okay, so
okay.
Practically, she's not going to join us.
Okay, so we can start with those who are available. Yeah. Okay, so I want to welcome everyone to this session of the Lagos Studies Association Conference. This is a session that has to do with authors meeting their readers. And for today, we have Olayinka Oyeleye, an independent scholar whose book we are considering today. And the title of the book is An African Feminist Philosophy Engaging an African Feminist Philosophy of Language. It's a book published by Routledge, and it was published in 2004. I am Professor Eboluwa Oduwole from Olabisi Onabanjo University. I'm the chair of this panel, panel 12A. And we have the author that I mentioned her name, Olayinka Oyeleye. And we have the discussants. We have 5 discussants. So we learned 1 will not be there, but I will just mention their names in case the person comes around. So the first discussant is Lindokwel Gama. Don't mind my pronunciation of your name. From Rhodes University in South Africa. It is Abosede Badiola from University of Hildesheim in Germany. And then the third discussant is Leye Komolafe from the University of South Carolina. And the 4th discussant is Zinleka Nobulalus from Southwestern University. Please don't mind the way I have butchered your name. When you come on, you can always tell us your name and pronounce it properly. So don't mind me. And then the last discussant is Adeoluoye Kon from Lagos State University in Nigeria here. So this is the way we are going about it. I'll give the author, the respondent, to 15 minutes to talk to her book. And then I'll give each of the discussants 10 minutes to discuss the book. And so I'll go over to Olayinka Oyeleye between 10 to 15 minutes. If you can make it in between, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I'm really delighted to be in this wonderful session. It's exciting. And yeah, it's a somewhat surreal moment for me to be here, sharing ideas from a project which took me quite a lot of years. It grew out of years of reflection, research, personal encounters with patriarchy, and of course, how we use language in patriarchal culture. I feel hugely grateful and honored to engage with such a thoughtful and insightful audience, academics. I want to just say, trace the trajectory of the work briefly. I was preparing for my PhD, and I'm so glad Dr. Ikpadiola is here, because I owe a lot to her regarding the work, and I just want to say that here quickly. I was preparing for my PhD, and I had this call, Codesria. There was a call for papers for the Gender Institute, and I was working on something else entirely, and I was just going to put this work forward, the feminist post-proverbial part of it. I was going to put it forward just for the conference, and I spoke with Dr. Ikpadiola and, sought our advice, and she said, what you're putting forward for that conference should actually be your thesis. I think you should work on that on your PhD. And so I discarded Heidegger or whatever it was I was working on then, and the journey started then, and we're here today. It's a book, and it has laid the groundwork for what we are now beginning to call an African feminist philosophy of language. The book is divided into 5 chapters. The very core of it is in the 5th chapter. I mean, the first chapter just traced the trajectory of African feminism, as an offshoot of Western feminism, and all the disruptions we have had, even within African feminism. The second chapter talked about decolonization, just a bit theoretical. The third chapter considered the idea of woman, especially from trace the idea of patriarchy, matriarchy in the African context. And then we kind of concluded on what really is woman. When we say someone is a woman, and we begin to think about this, especially in our own African languages, what does it mean? And the 4th chapter, I looked at the concept of language game, and proverbs, as well as post-proverbials, which is Aderemi Raji-Oyelade's work, actually. I just added, it's just an addendum, the feminist part of it. So, just so we take it off the humoristic sense in which it was initially, what it was initially, which is more of humor. So I took it out of that humoristic sense and, made it a more critical engagement from a feminist perspective and to meet the feminist agenda. So yeah, I looked at about 20 proverbs in that 4th chapter, collected from different regions in Africa. And yeah, so what I did was to state the proverb. The methodology was simple: state the proverb, do a brief analysis on what the literal meaning of the proverb is, and then suggest a reconstruction of the proverb. In the 5th chapter, I then discussed, what an African feminist philosophy of language, what a feminist philosophy of language is in the Western sense, and what we expect an African feminist philosophy of language to be. I was just literally drawing parallels between both schools of thought. And yes, an African feminist philosophy of language definitely leans heavily on the philosophy of language itself, on the language problem in Africa as it is, and of course on feminist philosophy of language. I also thought about ways forward. I mean, aside deconstructing and reconstructing proverbs, what else can we do? I looked at so many concepts. I looked at everyday sexism. I'm presently working on one aspect of it, which is within the Yoruba cosmology, within the Yoruba language sphere, how we kind of relate the concept of iya and iya, that the way they sound, the phonetic connection, and that similarity between iya. It's almost as if being a mother is synonymous to you having to suffer. So I'm presently looking at that and trying to see how, once again, that can be disrupted. So basically what I've done with the book is to look at proverbs. I have infiltrated a sphere which was initially seen as sacrosanct, something that you do not go near. I have attempted to infiltrate it, to disrupt it, and to subvert. And that essentially is what I think is foundational to when we say an African feminist philosophy of language, because we are trying to reconstruct how patriarchal language has shapened our own conception of gender, and how we see ourselves as African women and all the rest of it. So it is important that it's a space that we cannot just come into and change. Yes, it's a clamor for social change, but it's not something that's going to happen in a day. So we would need, like I have done, to infiltrate whatever sphere. And I've said it's whatever sphere we use language in, once we detect that language is being used in a demeaning sense, in a patriarchal sense, where woman is being demeaned or disparaged, once language isn't being used in a way that's neutral or suggesting that woman amounts to something, it is a space that I believe that we should infiltrate, we should disrupt and subvert. So yeah, the book is a deeply personal and political exploration of how language shapes and is shaped by histories of gender, colonialism, and resistance. And we're putting forward that resistance and trying to change the status quo. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Olayinka Oyeleye. Thank you for a brief introduction to the book. I always love that the author explains herself or himself, so that we'll know whether the discussants actually understand the point of view of the author and whether they know where the author is coming from or going to. I can see Oyekon Adeolu.
Yes.
So he's physically present now. So I'll just go the way of, is Gamma Lindoquil, is he here? Yes, you are here. So you are the first discussant, and I will hand over to you now. Thank you. We'll give you 15 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you very much, Dr. Oyeleye, for really what was a brilliant text to read. I really enjoyed it. And I think the suggestion to look towards post-proverbials is so important in light of the need to have alternative discourses. Often, as you rightly point out in your text, African contexts are taken in extremes, either to be super matriarchal or super patriarchal. But I think your text points out that it's much more complicated, and these are ambivalent spaces, and we can tap into what can immediately seem like something that's oppressive, but we can take it and subvert it and use it towards our own aims. So I think that the larger aim of the text really spoke to me. And I think you succeeded in that endeavor. The chapter that spoke to me most is one titled The Dehumanized Woman in History, Philosophy, and Culture, because that speaks to my own research. And in that chapter, you presented us with a person in question having surveyed literature that argues that there's often an assumed patriarchal structure in Africa that does not account for supposed matriarchal configurations. But you don't really buy into this. You ask if the presence of women with relative substantive power, such as the queens of the Pabir or the Bantu matrilineal society, straightforwardly suggests the dominance of women in Africa or the dominance of women over men. And herein you answer in the negative, arguing, along with others that you draw from, that there's often a category mistake committed here that conflates matrilineality with matriarchy. And I tend to agree with this point. If one looks at my own context, being in South Africa, and you look at the rituals of incorporation or our normative customs that generate personhood, there are some clearly anatomical based practices and regulative limits embedded in these practices that limits the personhood of women. For example, if I look to the practice of male initiation, which we call ulwaluko, practiced by Xhosa cultural groups, you don't find young Xhosa women being part of that process. And yet that process generates so much legitimacy within that cultural space. And in there, to become gendered male or to learn the kind of social rules and social roles designated to men gives one, especially men, substantive power. And if it were true that there are multiple genders, as you pointed out, that some would argue that, we are matriarchal societies in some senses, and that, patriarchy is an importation. If it were true that there are multiple genders that are not attached to specific social rituals to become intelligible persons in the African context, then we should all be able to participate in this practice, right? And whichever practice we deem fit to our desires. But there are clear gendered cultural limitations, especially in my cultural context, inscribed into these practices that correspond with one's body. Another example is that of paying damages for women being impregnated outside of wedlock. In Swati culture communities, Swati cultural communities refer to this practice as umzalaso, which quite literally means to spread your legs, which is a cultural practice of a man paying a fine in the form of a cow for impregnating a woman outside of wedlock. And on the surface of it, this kind of could seem empowering. You've done something wrong to this woman, and so you're paying this fine. But the fine is paid because the man is understood to have done something immoral and an immoral act to the father of the woman. About the acts of impregnation out of wedlock, still there seems to be wanting to protect the dignity of the man in a practice that on the surface of it seems empowering to women. So the act of impregnating the woman is understood to be metaphorically entering the kraal of the man, as I said, and the father of the woman without their permission. So once again, you need the permission of another man for your own body. And we say, so you've opened the kraal of another man without another man's permission. As such, the act is a form of disrespect to the father of the woman and the larger progeny for which the woman is a member. And so I was really convinced by your discussion there about how power dynamics shift and change depending on practices as well as where one socially finds themselves. So despite the sexual act having been enacted between two consenting persons, it is the woman who's deemed to be damaged, the man is not damaged by this act. Altogether, these examples point to the fact that it's not in all instances that there are genderless relations in African communities. And it begs the question, which I think you as well, whether this kind of relationality that we speak about in African personhood theories is truly open to all persons. And I argue in a similar vein that you do, using counterexamples, that there's enough to suggest that our communities are actually patriarchal and do so and have survived outside of a colonial imposition. These practices have survived way before such an encounter. So what stood out most for me beyond what I intuitively agree with is the thesis that you offer as well, that there is a becoming of a woman that's evident in African contexts, something that you take from Simone de Beauvoir and try to do a similar thing there. And you assert that the transition from girlhood to womanhood marks not only a biological shift, but also a cultural moment in which the female person becomes fully inscribed into the dual economies of productive and reproductive labor. And the onset of menstruation in this framing is treated as a threshold, one through which the girl enters womanhood by becoming simultaneously available for childbirth and for forms of labor that contribute to the household, community, or economic survival on gender-related lines. And so womanhood then is not a passive identity, but a role assigned and activated through cultural encoded expectations of motherhood and labor. So in short, Oyeleye argues that it is in this convergence, this indistinguishability of reproductive and productive labor that defines the female person and cements her moral and social personhood. While I find this framing rich in its socio-anthropological scope and the fact that it draws important attention to the culturally embedded nature of gendered personhood in a patriarchal order, I'm concerned about what this framing forecloses for different interpretations of womanhood or the rejection of womanhood altogether, and how one would explain this reproductive and labor conflation wherein a woman has decided to live a different kind of cultural script, whether because biologically there are limitations or because she's chosen to reject this positionality. So this position risks, in my view, over-determining the female body as a site of social inscription in ways that might inadvertently reinforce rather than critique the essentialist link between biology and gender. So by grounding the shift from girlhood to womanhood so squarely in the biological event of menstruation, and then attaching it to the expectations of motherhood and labor, the argument may entrench a view of womanhood that excludes non-normative gendered experiences. For instance, I've already said, how do we understand those who menstruate but do not identify as women, or women who never menstruate, never bear children, or resist caregiving roles? Does their failure to meet those thresholds mean they remain incomplete or outside the bounds of cultural personhood if there's this kind of move from one liminal stage to the other, as you've pointed out? Second, while the chapter offers a powerful critique of how cultural systems impose labor on the female body, it argues two analytic distinct kinds of labor, productive and reproductive, into a singular experience that I think risks erasing the historical and structural differences between economic production, which is often waged and externally valued, and reproductive labor, which is often unwaged and visibilized. And feminist political economy scholars, especially in African context, have long that we attend how reproductive labor is devalued precisely because it is feminized. So reproductive labor becoming visible in this framework to try and how womanhood becomes gendered and subordinates us, which I completely buy into. I'm interested to hear how that framework, if you believe that framework could begin to obscure and undo the work that the feminist political economists have done for us in exposing that these two things are separate. If you think that presents a problem, or if indeed that framework works for what it works for, and this is another distinction that allows for us to see something in a very particular kind of a way. But overall, I quite enjoyed the book. And can't wait for more that you have to say as you develop the African feminist language. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gamma from Rhodes University. I hope Oyeleye is making her jottings so that you can respond after all the discussants have made their points. So we'll go to the next discussant, Abosede Padiola from Germany. And I want, when you are discussing, you've also written a book, which I'm privileged to have reviewed for the publisher. I want you to, after discussing her own book, relate it to what you have done too. Let's see, are you on the same line, or you disagree with her, or you agree with her, or you think what she has done, she should do more than that. She has said that you are her mentor and you guided her. So we want to see exactly in practical terms those ways in which you put her through the writing of the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Good evening, Ma. I'm also so thrilled to be here. And thank you very much, Dr. Oyeleye, for giving us this book. I know, just as a Prof has said, I've been there. And Prof has been there several times before now, so a lot goes into preparing a manuscript. So congratulations, Dr. Oyeleye, and thank you very much for this book. Good evening, everyone. So I'll be looking at a review of this monograph called the title, An African Feminist Philosophy of Language. And as Prof has requested, I would also at the end say one or two things about my book, Feminist African Philosophy, Women and the Politics of Difference in relation to the African Feminist Philosophy of Language. And interestingly, both books published by Routledge, mine published in 2023, and Dr. Oyeleye's book just published this year, 2025. So An African Feminist Philosophy of Language is written in 5 chapters, beginning with an introduction. The book underscores the centrality of language to African women's marginalization and patriarchal oppression. It stresses the patriarchal hierarchies embedded in African cultures, primarily through language, and urges a critical examination of how language sustains gender inequalities, advocating for a linguistic turn in African feminism, using language as a tool to challenge patriarchal norms and reconceptualize the notion of woman in a manner that aligns with African realities. The author introduces the concept of African Feminist Philosophy of Language, AFPL, which seeks to analyze the meaning and concepts of women within African social, cultural, and linguistic contexts. The introduction also, the book also situates African, that is AFPL, for now, AFPL within the broader context of African feminist scholarship, emphasizing the need to rethink African feminisms and transform rhetorical spaces to empower women. It underscores the importance of language as a tool for social change and intellectual resistance against patriarchal oppression. The author's analysis finds Gertrude Spivack's notion of epistemic violence instructive in articulating language as a site of oppression for African women. It also identifies the significance of language as an essential tool for gaining liberation from patriarchal oppression, or mechanism for actualizing or achieving for African women. The author alludes to Walter Mignolo's epistemic disobedience in a description of the power of language to liberate. The author argues that Western and African feminisms differ in their conceptualizations or definitions of women. As the terminology used for the schools of thought in African feminisms, fascinating, really fascinating. Especially the division of groups into division theorists who argue that gender hierarchies were introduced through colonization, and acclivity theorists who believed gender inequalities existed in pre-colonial Africa, but the situation got worsened under colonial rule. So this is one point of, and I love the fact that Dr. Oyeleye gave these terminologies, gave us this nomenclature, that is declension and acclivity. I also have something similar in my book, but I did not name the two groups. I also highlight the tension between these two groups within African feminist scholarship. So I also looked at that. Various African feminist frameworks, such as womanism, motherism, and negofeminism, for their different approaches to gender, culture, and power dynamics. This, in my view, is one of the high points of the African feminist philosophy of language. The book also highlights the impact of colonization on the structures of African languages, describing it as a form of epistemicide. Therefore, it emphasizes the importance of quasi-Wiredu's concept of decolonization, or conceptual decolonization, as a way to reclaim the autonomy and significance of African languages, as well as African women's liberation. Quasi-Wiredu's conceptual decolonization is introduced as a crucial approach for African feminist scholarship. Wiredu supports translating Western concepts into African languages to evaluate their relevance and build them within indigenous frameworks. The text also explores the philosophy of language and post-structuralism, focusing on the need to challenge traditional linguistic structures in order to create new meanings and perspectives. The author argues that African feminist scholarship critically analyzes how language constructs gender roles and identities. They explore how linguistic practices such as proverbs and oral traditions often portray women in derogatory ways, reinforcing their oppression. The author explores the distinction between matriarchy and patriarchy on the one hand, and between matriarchy and matrilineality on the other hand. The author highlights the Akan, Bantu, and Pabe people's matrilineal systems to bolster the claim that patriarchy is not universal, as Western feminism tends to suggest. An African feminist philosophy of language, that the book emphasizes the concept of feminist post-proverbials as a way to challenge and dismantle patriarchal oppression in Africa linguistically. The term coined by Aderemi Oyeleye, these are parodied and reconstructed that defy traditional meanings and offer new interpretations. They are described as postmodern, post-structural, and post-colonial constructs that break down the fixed nature of conventional proverbs and mirror contemporary realities. Feminist post-proverbials, according to the author, include reinterpreting proverbs to highlight women's resilience, economic power, and contributions to society. I've always found feminist post-proverbials interesting and brilliant. And also my book, Feminist African Philosophy, Women and the Politics of Difference, I talked about feminist post-proverbials, although still from Oyeleye's perspective in my conclusion. So it's there. And that's why I'm always very grateful to her for coming up with this concept, for articulating this concept. Thank you very much. So I've always found it really, really brilliant. However, I have some concerns, which are not just limited to feminist post-proverbials, but to post-proverbials generally. The question is about the visibility of the post-proverbials method. Although the author argues that using post-proverbials to recast or transform proverbs that have sexist connotations is beyond play or satire. it remains ambivalent about how to achieve this. This is because Africans, particularly the Yoruba, have been experimenting with post-proverbials as a mere jest for decades. For example, growing up, I used to hear there are certain proverbs that I will give to you now. There's a proverb in Yoruba that they say this way: "Màálù tí ò ní rù, Ọlọ́run ní bá lé ṣinṣin." That is, a cow that has no depends on God for driving away flies. We know cattle use their tails to drive away flies, but when a cow does not have a tail, what happens to it? It depends on God. Now the original form of that proverb, that's how it's been said originally. But at that point, I don't know when, it was changed to Màálù tí ò ní rù, ó pọ̀ ní Ṣàngó. I believe those of us who were raised in Ibadan must be familiar with that proverbial, the formula of that. They say Màálù tí ò ní rù, ó pọ̀ ní Ṣàngó. That is, a teenage cattle, you have so many of them in Ṣàngó. And when I was growing up in the 80s, in the early 80s, I believe it was already so popular. The version was already really popular. I suspect so strongly that it was reformulated maybe in the 60s, in the 50s or 60s or early 70s, because by the time I was growing up, that is that I was old enough to know it was already really popular, that sometimes if you even say the first part, people would definitely complete it using the revised form. And also there's another one, I say mole. And at this point, what is interesting about this proverb that I've talked about is that at the point that I was old enough to know, to be conscious of my environment and things around, Sango was no longer the markets. For those of us who know Ibadan very well, the markets, there's a small market in Sango, but the market there is not, they don't sell cows, they don't sell cattle there. So it must have happened a long time ago. And also there's another one, they say it's a mole. Normally it's supposed to be ole moloko. That is, if a thief comes to your farm and the owner of the owner of the farm does not arrest the thief, then the thief turns against the owner and arrests the owner. That's the original way it's spoken. But later it was changed to, it is a mole ole salo, that if you fail to apprehend a thief that comes to steal from your farm, then the thief runs away or the thief escapes. So, and these are very popular sayings that have been adopted for so long. So it's been, now my question to Dr. Oyeleye is, you also noted that concern, I believe, and you also spoke about it a while ago, but how would you now take something that has been a method that has been in use and that has been used in a particular way to make it to work for you as a feminist scholar to achieve your goal concerning post-proverbials as a method for interrogating patriarchal oppression? So I would like to know, that is one. Issue I would like to highlight concerns the dubious or ambiguous nature of the patriarchal system or systems, as the case may be, which sometimes, I will explain, which sometimes allows it to persist unnoticed in language, or when it employs ambiguous language. An example of this is seen in cases when certain practices are not explicitly named. For example, in my primary school, we learned a subject called family living. In this class, children learn about different types of families, different types of marriage, and related topics. I believe some of us should remember that we had a subject like that in our primary school. So I thought that there are two types of marriage, polygamous and monogamous. And my emphasis now is now on polygamous type marriage. The nature of patriarchy lies in how that practice is labeled. That is the practice, the practice of polygamy is labeled with difference or ambiguity. Polygamy is meant to be gender neutral because it's gender neutral. If you say polygamy, it should be gender neutral. However, is the practice as it is carried out across Africa gender neutral? In cases where patriarchy has mastered the arts of manipulating or circumventing language to keep itself alive, can AFPL help African women break free from its bonds? So those would be my two questions for the author this evening. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Prof.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was a very deep one. And then we'll now go to the third discussant. We've listened to the author, a woman, the first discussant, a woman, the second discussant, a woman. And so we want to listen to the men. I know that when we talk about feminism, when we talk about feminist discourse, it's not about women, it's not about men, it's about your ideas. It's about the ideas that you put forward. To the extent that a man can be a feminist and a woman can be a feminist. So we want to hear from Leye Komolafe from the University of South Carolina. Please, if you have any question, anything you want to add, you can always drop something for us in the chat box. Thank you. Leye Komolafe, over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof. It's good to be here again to see my former teacher, my perennial teacher, Dr. Padiola. Thanks for being a support all along. And it's good to see you again, Auntie Yinka. And thanks for the invite to join this discussion. So, you've dropped something on our plate. You've dropped something really huge on our plate. And I would like to start with what one of my teachers in Ife would say, Jarila Doshu. He says, when you have an elephant on your plate, where do you start from? And he says, well, just start from anywhere, right? Because you've done so much in this text that we can't even exhaust within this short period of time of engaging the text. So I'm going to just draw on one aspect of it going forward. But before then, I'd like to identify what I consider are the central themes in this book. The first is that you raise a critical point around the significance of a linguistic turn in feminist discourse. And then you're trying to use the feminist philosophy of language, as a theorizing unit that African feminists going forward can actually tap into for reconstructing gender narratives in Africa. And for this, you then believe that we could deploy rhetoric as a tool for reinvention and conceptualizing what woman means, and then to re-signify what a woman is within the African domain. And then you then believe also that the question of what African feminism is must turn on the question of language. And I think that is the core of the philosophy of language dimension in this book. And you also made a point that the same medium through which oppression comes is the same medium through which it should be addressed. It's language. Language being the mode of subordination should also be the corrective channel. You then made additional point that we should turn on the indigenous, and then we should also include the decolonizing mission. I have some questions for the decolonizing mission that you raised, but let's leave that for now. I'll come to that later. And then you believe that proverbs actually have doxastic elements. And then its extended counterparts, which is post-proverbials, can also be deployed, using the same mechanism. And this is what you did extensively in the I think in the 4th chapter of the book, going forward to the 5th chapter. I mean, you turned many proverbs that have been used as in derogatory manner, you turn them around, in post-proverbial. So you move the discourse beyond just seeing post-proverbials as, just made out of certain proverbs. You took on some serious proverbs, and then you turn them around using the post-proverbial lens. Yes. So to come to the text, on why it is important to engage it from the position of language. Yes, the limit of our language is the limit of our world, says Ludwig Wittgenstein. And conversely also, the scope of our language determines the landscape of our reality. And how does this work? It means we shape reality with language. Words don't necessarily create, but we use words in shaping our reality, such that when the term is used and then it is re-emphasized and reinforced over time, it then becomes the reality of the people. Not necessarily because that word itself creates the reality, but because we use this to shape. And this is the same way that language has been used to shape what a woman is within the African domain. And this is why it is important to engage critically on this subject. So our thoughts, pass through language, to borrow what physicists would say, using the refrangibility of light. So when words travel through a particular medium, not only does it doesn't reflect what reality is, right? But it is then used, when it passes through that prism, it is then used as a form of organizing, not just thought, but organizing what our reality ought to be. So when the term is used in a derogatory manner, it then becomes the labeling, that then becomes the reality of a people at a particular point in time. And this happens within different framework, and especially within the African culture which you are engaging with. So one inevitable conclusion from what I've said so far is that a patriarchal language would always inevitably yield a patriarchal worldview. So I move now straight to your work. My interpretation of one of Oyeleye's endeavor in this book is that it is instructive that gendered, linear, eliminative, and macroscopic worldview be challenged. And to do this, as she puts it, is to investigate language use, and now it relates to discourse on gender. This is on the first page of the text. This awareness implicitly births what she calls the possibility of an African feminist philosophy of language, because it's the first condition to realize how language is used and then to be able to engage with it critically. And now, deconstructing the patriarchal prism earlier identified and designing an African feminist philosophy of language is a monumental task, as there are problematics to be encountered. And as noted by Oyeleye, the core being the problem of conceptualization, that is, how woman is conceptualized and extended as a category of being. Oyeleye carefully identifies how most African cultures are patriarchal, and by sheer logical inference, it follows that the languages of these cultures will be loaded with patriarchal vocabulary. So if we then begin at some preliminary stage, if you ask the question, who or what is a woman at the preliminary stage, Oyeleye could respond by saying, well, we need to look towards the sociocultural context within which the term has been used, and subsequently subject those views to critical reflection in order to discover our answer. And that was what she did within this text, subjecting the concept to serious interrogation. How has it been used, even within scholarly writings, within cultural worldview and all. So this response, which is that is we have to engage with the concept from the sociocultural context within which it is used, bears two useful implications. First, it recognizes the term woman as currently underserved, as it is inappropriately, though conspicuously asserted within our language use. Second, It demonstrates that the term, as currently used within cultural context, reflects certain significations that need to be disrupted and subverted. Oyeleye supplies existing historical, anthropological, and intertextual discourses to support these explications. In my evaluation, this is where the critical searchlight of philosophical conception of woman begins. As Oyeleye makes it the starting point to step beyond our existing use of language in describing woman, be it proverbial, colloquial, pejorative, or mundane. So to engage with what is a woman is to go beyond how this has been used within proverbs, colloquial, mundane, and pejorative, ordinary language, as the case might be. So a subversion of the everyday use of language, which embodies subjugation and agential limitation of women, is implicitly pertinent. This is part of the text. This is what she intends to do. In furthering the aim of the book, Oyeleye adds a second layer of engagement, which I consider as the colonial bend. Although I find this suave towards the colonial agenda somewhat less illuminating, and I think it's a digression of what you could have actually pushed for that. But I understand the argument you're pushing, because it fits your inclination towards indigenizing African feminist philosophy of language. Because if you wanted to engage with African feminist philosophy of language from a quite universal way, then you need not go into this decolonial bend, right? But you think it is important to do this, and then you added decolonial bend. But we'll discuss it this much more. So I'm willing to engage this during the Q&A. So hence, from gender fluidity to the deconstruction of man-woman conceptual dichotomy, and personhood to justify the colonial leaning throughout the text. It is also worth noting that Oyeleye's indigenizing mission in the book is for linguistic interrogation and reconstruction. It should not be confused for uncritical cultural validation or essentialism. As a matter of fact, the adoption of post-proverbia as linguistic signifiers of philosophical thought capable of altering patriarchal codes locked within proverbs lends credence to this interpretation. As she puts it on the 78th page of the text, however popular the claims might be, it opens up a new vista by which I can show post-proverbia as a parodied proverbs that are suggestively philosophical. My interest in the import of the post-proverbia is not far-fetched. While this work leans heavily on the indigenous, the cultural and literary theory of post-proverbia, it is also deeply philosophical and unwavering feminist. So we should not confuse the idea of trying to indigenize this thought to mean that she's trying to unravel some cultural beliefs and then essentialize them. She's taking it beyond that discourse. This view is carefully thought and expanded for a few reasons, and primary among them is that fossil path where patriarchal hegemony is represented, propelled.
1 minute go.
How many minutes?
1.
Oh my! All right. I'll hurry up now. Thank you. Oh my! All right. That's the fossil path from which patriarchal hegemony is represented and propelled, and also insulated from any kind of disruptive idea, is through proverbs. And because she uses the Yoruba framework for her work, and as we know, the Yoruba people place so much emphasis on proverbs because they take them to be a medium of transmitting ethical normatives, for transfusing generational wisdom and what have you, to the point that they are taken as sacrosanct, and it's difficult to actually rupture these proverbs, which I think is why earlier post-proverbials were mere jests. They didn't take on proverbs in a serious manner because they considered those proverbs to be sacrosanct. So the only thing they can do is just to create some kind of parody in a justly manner, not in serious engagement. But Oyeleye took this beyond just mere engagement with proverbs in this way of making some jest, because she believes that is from within the proverbs, which are actually happen to be the most forceful elements of hegemony of patriarchy within the Yoruba culture, because they're taken to be strong, they're taken to be the words of our fathers. In fact, that's another language of patriarchy, the words of our fathers, transported through time to us and what have you. So she thinks that it is by rupturing these proverbs that we can then orchestrate a new kind of engagement through language. And she calls on African feminists going forward to engage with language in this manner, and then to use post-proverbial as some kind of trope in engaging patriarchal structures. So maybe when it's time for questions and comments, I could throw a few things that I have, more of the things I have up. So thank you so much for giving us.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you so much. We'll go straight to Adeolu Oyiko. He is in person and is going to address us now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Yeah.
You have 10 minutes.
All right, ma'am. So, I want to congratulate the talk, and I also want to appreciate everyone here, starting from my Professor Duwale. Lindo, so good to see you again and to hear from you again. And yeah. So, I'm just going to read through my jottings and then maybe take it from there when we get to the question. Feminism can transform the structures of inequality that women and other marginalized groups. Over the years, African feminism is a trend in research that is grounded in the specific of the African continent. It resists the uncritical adoption. Instead, seeks to foreground the lived realities, struggles, and aspirations of African women. On the other hand, philosophy of language, as a branch of philosophy, concerns itself with the nature, function, and limits of language, traditionally dominated by Western males. Has often overlooked how language relates to gender, power, and cultural differences, especially in non-Western societies. So the intersection of feminism, African thought, and philosophy of language provides a fertile ground for rethinking how language constructs and constrains the shaping and making of identity, especially in African societies. To that extent, the book, An African Feminist Philosophy of Language by Olayinka represents an important contribution to this conversation by intervening in these overlapping fields and bringing African feminist perspectives into dialogue with philosophical questions about language, meaning, power, and framing. In the first chapter, Oyeleye critically examines the evolution of feminist theory, focusing on Western feminist movements, and then transitioning to the distinct development of Black and African feminisms. He interrogates the question of what it means to be a woman, and then tries to show that the category woman is historically and politically constructed rather than universally fixed. He also explores various African feminist approaches, each of which emerged in response to the limitations of Western feminism. These movements, in their differences, share the singular view that African women's experiences are shaped by colonial histories, cultural practices, and social class in ways that differ from what obtains in the West. He also argues that despite their diversity, many African feminist theories have also not adequately focused on how language itself constructs and reinforces gender oppression. She highlights that the category of what it means to be a woman cannot be meaningfully understood outside the linguistic and cultural context that shapes such meanings. In the second chapter, she addresses how colonial epistemologies have shaped African knowledge systems, including feminist discourses. Drawing on post-colonial and decolonial thinkers, she argues that the colonization of African minds has been largely mediated through language. So she pivoted to the issue of conceptual decolonization, emphasizing that African feminists must first decolonize the language they use to resist patriarchal oppression. We also see the critique of the dominance of Western epistemological categories in African scholarship and the highlight of the failures of many African feminist studies to fully interrogate the philosophy of language. Oyeleye's book also underscores that the African academy often functions as a colonial space, which inadvertently reproduces the power structures it seeks to challenge. So the essence of that chapter is for African feminist scholars to reclaim indigenous languages as the vehicles of feminist thought and social transformation. In the third chapter, we see a focus on the Yoruba worldview and cultural practices, especially as they relate to the dehumanization of women. We saw the metaphysical and ontological analysis of the Yoruba concept of personhood, which shows that that society categorizes women into three roles: girl, child, woman, and mother, which then in turn shape expectations, limitations, and the social value attached to women at different stages of life. The chapter also demonstrates that Yoruba oral traditions, proverbs, and other corpus encode patriarchal worldviews that marginalize and devalue women. Also see a very brilliant analysis of how this cultural test perpetuates misogynistic power relations and how women's social worth is often reduced to their reproductive and domestic roles. Oyeleye shows that indigenous patriarchy operates as a deeply embedded cultural logic that shapes the lived realities of women across generations. In the fourth chapter, which is perhaps about the most important, she argues that African proverbs, which are traditionally considered wise sayings, often perpetuate sexism and normalize the subjugation of women. These proverbs, which are embedded in everyday language, contribute to the reproduction of patriarchal practices. Oyeleye proposes that instead of discarding proverbs entirely, they can be reconstructed through the creation of post-proverbials, which refers to new proverbs that retain cultural familiarity but offer egalitarian and feminist meaning. These feminist post-proverbials are intended, from my own understanding, to linguistic and cultural status quo by reimagining the research what chapter which encourages African feminists to engage with and transform
Can you move closer to the microphone? And you have just 3 minutes to go.
Oyeleye emphasizes the need for interventions across popular culture, education, and social media, arguing that feminist linguistic work must extend beyond academic spaces into everyday social life. And she positions AFPL as a bridge between philosophy, feminist theory, and cultural activism, one that can help push the agenda of social change. The chapter serves as a manifesto, sort of, calling for sustained feminist engagement with the linguistic structures that organize oppression and urges African philosophers to see language not as a passive medium, but as a powerful site of both domination and liberation. Now to some general comments. I see Oyeleye's work as a valuable response to works on African feminism that seek to romanticize pre-colonial or traditional African feminist practices as a way of responding to condescending Western universalist assumptions. It makes the point very clear, in my view, that we can and must go about the decolonization project in ways that are reasonably critical of indigenous cultural practices and structures. Also, the post-proverbial approach addresses the need for new, yet indigenous knowledge creation in Africa, as opposed to the saturation of the epistemic space with backward-looking adventures in search for solutions to problems that are contemporary in nature. This brings me to the third observation, which has to do with whether the author then we would like to consider the periodization of proverbs and practices to distinguish between what used to be and what is, unless, of course, there is the assumption that feminist practices in traditional Yoruba culture have generally been the same, even with Africa's contact with Western culture. It will also be interesting to see what the author thinks about whether there's a need for us to dig more deeply into the implications of Africa's cultural plurality for the post-proverbial project, given that a single approach may not be sufficient in addressing what is admittedly a continent-wide or even global challenge. In other words, is there a possibility of finding at least one African society where patriarchy is entrenched but not necessarily through proverbs? Also, given that proverbs are themselves manifestations, not necessarily the root causes of gender discrimination, although they eventually become tools of normalization, are there complementary approaches or efforts that can be useful in the quest for gender equity in Africa? I also had the question in my mind of whether the author agrees with the view that there is a suppression, perhaps inadvertently, of the oppression against masculine folks who have been unquestionably regarded in popular parlance as the root cause of imbalanced gender relations in African culture. Lastly, I will also wish to know whether the author considers the idea of decolonizing feminist language a highly nuanced endeavor in the face of shared gender challenges across cultures. If that is so, to what extent is decoloniality relevant to the post-proverbial project, given that it is an inward-looking and self-critical exercise? In conclusion, while I look forward to responses that further enlighten the audience from the author, I must say that this is reading for scholars in feminist philosophy, African studies, linguistics, and cultural studies. It's particularly very useful to those interested in the exploration of the intersections of language and decoloniality. It offers a very powerful framework of linguistic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to sincerely thank all the discussants. You have done a very good job to the book. I actually decided to give them enough time because a lot of our participants may not have read the book. And with the author presenting the book to us and then the discussant discussing the book, it gives them a vivid idea of what the book is about. I find that chapter on proverbs and post-proverbial proverbials, between proverb and post-proverbials, chapter 4, very, very interesting, because when we are talking about, we are already on the discussion and the Q&A. So because I'm the chairman, I've just decided to seize the opportunity to be the first to pass my own comments. When we are talking about gender discourse, feminist discourse, female subjugation, and so on, and then we go into feminist ethics, we go into feminist metaphysics, epistemology, and we always advise as teachers of gender philosophy that one of the ways in which we can ensure that female subjugation and female marginalization in all areas of thought is removed is when we begin to interrogate all the areas of philosophy, all the areas in which feminist subjugation has penetrated into. So we talk about feminist logic, we talk about feminist philosophy of language, we talk about feminist ethics, we talk about feminist metaphysics, epistemology, all areas of philosophy. Not only philosophy alone, but also we look at the language, we look at in terms of African culture, African language, and so on. It is when we begin to interrogate some of these and then we put them forward and replace those patriarchal tendencies, those androcentric tendencies, those misogynist tendencies with these post-proverbial sayings, for example, that we are now projecting what should be the case apart from what is the case. I will read a comment here in the chat box. Congratulations to, excuse me, please. Congratulations to Dr. Oyeleye for a very important and inspiring work. not read the text yet, but it is correct to assume that besides post-proverbials, is there the danger of semantic evolution of these proverbs, resulting in disrupted meanings over time, especially as determined by a post-colonial context? My inclination based on, is a very long one. My inclination based on experience is that there have been colonial and post-colonial alterations in the interpretation of language. My experience interrogating feminism among the Yoruba, including reading scholars like Oyeleye, indicates an indigenous thought system immune from gender binaries. My thought is that this presents the Yoruba as non-sexist, especially within the pre-colonial context, to avert the danger of inventions not rooted in tradition. Will it not be interesting to revisit the original context of these proverbs than going the way of post-proverbials? Did you get that? I hope you have an idea. That's the question from this person online. We have some participants here. I've not seen any hand raised up, and that's the only question that I have in the chat box. So I'll give the floor to Dr. Oyeleye to respond to the discussants and to respond to this question in the chat box while we are waiting for others that may want to signify their interest to ask questions or to write something in the chat box. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. The panelists, the audience. I'm so grateful once again. Thank you for listening. Thank you for reading. Thank you for thinking alongside me. I actually feel quite fulfilled in this moment, this very space, that what I set out to achieve when I wrote the book, like, when we say within critical theory and literary theory that the author is dead. So I do not have to be there to, like, you make your meaning. And for me, it is that the message I am trying to pass across, without being there to kind of break it down and literally explain it, was I able to pass that message across? And I really feel fulfilled in this moment, knowing that, yes, this was done in the engagement that you've had with the work. And yeah, I want to take the questions from the very last, the person that asked the question in the chat box. And I want to say, I'm glad you read Oyewumi. And for you to really, answering your question will just be, I don't think it will be really in-depth until you've read the book. Now, this book, I wouldn't say is a anti-Oyewumi Oyerunke's thinking, but her work actually served as a foundation to it, because I engaged with it during my master's, and in fact, I met her one-on-one in Ghana, and I had to ask her, did you set out to be controversial with this book? Because it didn't seem to me like this was my experience of the Yoruba society. And you're raising something very important here, that you feel that it is immune from gender binaries. And I'm thinking that is exactly what we're facing. It isn't immune. It is rooted in that binary system, in my own opinion. And as I did articulate in the work, one of the category mistakes that I think Oyewumi Oyerunke made was lumping the category of sex and gender as one. And I had to say, sex aside, sex is biological. Gender is more, in my own opinion, a social construction. So I said we can say akwaja, abo, when within, and I'm glad, I hope the person that asked the question, since you think it's Yoruba society is immune from gender binaries. So I want to assume that you are Yoruba or you are quite familiar with it. So when we say Ako and Abo, that would be male and female. That would translate to male and female in English language, but not necessarily woman or man. So in my opinion, when we then begin to talk about gender, that would be more a social construction, not a biological construction. And you talked about the semantic evolution. Now I'm trying to lump up quite a whole lot together, as well as answer to some of the things the discussants raised as well. We are forcing a semantic evolution. I think that is what the book is all about. It's not just sitting back and waiting. And I have had to respond to questions like this in conferences and book panels that I've presented this work in, to say that sometimes when, when it's not, I don't want to use the word not our problem, but, when the shoe isn't pinching us, we tend to take a different perspective. Let me use a proverb to kind of buttress that. Ilu bembeni, ibitoba koju sini. Do you understand? So I am assuming as well from that question that I have a male person asking the question. Now I'm using male and female, and which is what I have tried to use. In fact, sometimes it's so confusing to me because I've grown up with the idea of man and woman. So in this book, I have separated what it is to be a man, woman, from what it is to be male, female. So ako, abo, that is male, female. That is biological. But socially, you can then be man or woman. And I looked at the Western, the origin of Western feminism. I looked at people who were considered, reference to Sojourner Truth, who was feminine or female, but was not considered a woman because of her color, because of who she was. He raised that question, and I read it, still inspires me till tomorrow. Like, oh, am I not a woman? That was our question. Am I not a woman? Why can I not be a part of this conversation that is going on? Okay, I have done X and X and, all the things she said she had done, just like any man. And even in her appearance, she did look like she was a man. And that inspired me. I mean, that was in my earlier interactions with Western feminism. I saw that and I began to think, really, why wasn't Sojourner Truth considered as a result of her color? And as feminism, started to expand, the same thing happened. And this is why I'm trying to make this distinction, simply because of those who have not read the book. The same thing happened when we began to have feminism more in the Western sense, where the white women believe that, Betty Friedan, to be specific, in her book, believe that the problem without a name was because they were at home being women in the domestic sphere, trying to just maintain the home. And she wanted something that would take her out of the home, a job. And Bell Hooks had responded to that, well, that might be your problem as a white woman, because economically, that is not the problem of the African woman or the Black woman. Don't let me even bring African into it yet. That is not the problem of the Black woman, simply because the Black woman is already out there trying to make, without working, she cannot survive. So there was that disparity, that distinction already. And I realized that there was an otherness that was being created constantly. And by otherness, I simply mean there is one and then there is another. And which was the same thing that Simone de Beauvoir spoke about, that woman is simply the inferior in any context. Forget the fact that you're male or female, even amongst females. Once there is someone taking up that inferior role, that person becomes the woman, even amongst males and even amongst countries. So the creation of the concept of the other, in my opinion, is the woman. And so to come to Lynn's discussed, which I really enjoyed. Thank you so much for that. You talked about the thesis of the work, because I'm now on what Simone de Beauvoir talked about different interpretations of womanhood. But you raised a question, which I think chapter 3 probably wasn't too explicit as I would have loved to be. I am not arguing for the essentialist perception at all. I am not an essentialist. And becoming woman, which I looked at, especially from the Yoruba perspective, that woman is a becoming. Woman is not born. It's more like you have a male child and there's a more direct kind of path and processual phase for the male child, whereas for the woman, it is a becoming. There are so many different stages. And so I spoke about within Yoruba, when we say obìnrin, I distinguished between the girl child and then got to the phase where you're called obìnrin, which is the onset of menstruation within the Yoruba culture. That is when a female child actually becomes obìnrin, and then went on to talk about that reproductive and productive phase colliding, because with the onset of menstruation, the body of the female is then able to procreate. At the same time, because that would probably be a teenager of some, I'm just trying to look at it. I know that we have younger girls now who are already in that processual phase, but basically in that society at that point in time, that is at the point where production, where you actually go out to make money or work within the family business to kind of bring economic rewards home. So I was talking about how both phases, how both periods will collide. You just have the woman reproducing and at the same time producing, which isn't necessarily the same thing for the male child. And I just want to put something in quickly, once again, in response to the question in the chat box, that while it is kind of direct for the male child, now within a group of boys, you could have a comment like, "Kílódé tó ń ṣe bí obìnrin?" And that is meant to be derogatory because you're looking at a male, odidi ọkùnrin, permit me to use that Yoruba expression, odidi ọkùnrin, and owani ó ń ṣe bí obìnrin. So what I'm just saying is, you're saying a man is acting like a woman. It is demeaning for the male person to be seen to be acting like a woman, simply because the woman is considered the inferior. And that is to buttress my earlier argument about the superior, the one and the other, where the man is seen as the superior and the woman the inferior. And I said you would have that in any context. It's not solely about the sexes. Even amongst nations, amongst groups, amongst females, you will have that. So,
thank you. Let's go to some of the questions. We have 2 questions in the Q&A so that you can take them all together. And any comments, I think it's a comment by Leye Komolafe in the chat box. Ali Mazuri also supports the claim outside of the Yoruba context as well. That's also a comment supporting what you're saying. And then we have 2 questions in the Q&A by Kola Bankole. I agree that your interpretation that sex and gender are different, and yes, a social construction, not necessarily biological. It is true that Oyewumi is groundbreaking, and your work is taking her work further. And this, you are changing Western frameworks, sojourner truth. Am I not a woman? And he says further, colorism is an ugly element of racism. So it's the framing of what Black women had become the other in the United States. Lazy scholarship just add Black to Western feminism. Yeah. And then another comment, if Songo plated is here and dressed differently, at what point did it become wrong to behave like women? So can you take all of that together?
Well, let me start by saying that I do not know what it is like to behave like women. I do not understand that one. But about it being lazy scholarship with the label Black feminism, I think it isn't lazy scholarship. We were in search, and I say we now because African feminism is an offshoot of Black feminism. We were in search of a nomenclature. The first thing you want to do is identify yourself by something. And if you feel you don't identify with the larger body of feminist thought, which did not really include, and I said earlier, Ilu Bembeni, the perspectives of Black women weren't included in that conversation. So the Black women seemingly broke out of it and tried to kind of champion their own cause. African women as well felt that, no, what you're talking about really does not concern the woman, the African female, for want of a better concept now, that the African female on the continent, what you're talking about isn't their business. And and they had to create their own thing, African feminism. And then realizing that even within the continent, our needs as women, it is just so disenfranchised. It's all broken into tiny bits, and for me, I said this is one of the beauty, rather than seeing it that, oh, African feminism isn't all put together and, we have all this fragment. I think it is one of the beauties of African feminism. I even suggested looking at the concept woman, look at all the beautiful languages we have in Africa, over 3,000, and see how woman is used in all of those languages. So just to answer that, I wouldn't agree that it was lazy scholarship adding that label, because even within us as Africans, we've had every other kind of label, created. And I'm just saying that rather than keep having that fragment and all of that, I think one of the things we need to do is look into our language, which is where I went into Kwasi Wiredu's conceptual decolonization, to say that for us to really have decolonization, we are trying to delink from the West. If I keep thinking about woman in this Western sense, it will make a different meaning. So let me bring it down to my own language. Obinrin. What does Obinrin mean in Yoruba? And which is why I gave you an earlier example. If you call a man Obinrin, you are insulting him. So why is that? So that is what I mean by language use, and having us all look at that from all the different languages we speak and our culture. I think it's going to be a beautiful, not starting point because we started already, but it's going to be a beautiful addendum to the conversation. But to go back to what being a woman, I do not understand that at all. I do not understand what being a woman. Someone raised that. If the person can expatiate further, I would appreciate it. But I don't understand what being a woman is, because woman isn't one. We are not just, it isn't just being female, like, oh yeah, biologically I'm female. That does not necessarily make me a woman. If I don't agree that I am inferior, if I'm going by that conversation, by that definition of the one and the other, if I don't see myself, if I don't identify within that relationship or grouping that I am the other, then I do not see that I am woman. So I do not really understand what being a woman is.
Thank you very much.
Okay, there was something just popped up on.
We have just 3 minutes to go. You remember something? We don't have any question in the Q&A. We don't have any comments on the chat box. So you can just go ahead with your last comments.
There's a question from the audience.
Okay, there's a question from the audience. We have some participants in person. Please, can we have your question?
Thank you very much. Grandma, the grandma.
We can't hear you. We can't hear you. Can you move closer to the microphone?
Can you hear now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, so I was greeting our grandma, the teacher of all the teachers in the room. Yes, ma'am. So I wanted to quickly ask Dr. Oyeleye, which part of this work would you really want us to teach in class? I've not read the book, but with this conversation, I'm so impressed with all the things you've been talking about. There are things we talk about in an average class of philosophies of feminism, and probably there are things that we also do in gender studies. But is there a particular part, just like you want some of this to be taught in a philosophy class, are there specific parts of it that you really want to spotlight? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ma. Every part of the work is important. If you take out chapter 1, which is the bedrock, you will not grapple with the ideas in the other chapters. But if I would have to kind of answer to what you said, I would say take chapters 3 to 5, because they're the ones that are deeply African. Take chapters 3 to 5. They all follow logically from each other. And yeah, that should be taught in class. And thank you so much for that comment. You actually gave me goose pimples. What's it called? Goosebumps. Thank you so much. I am just a deeply emotional person.
I was going to answer that question for her by saying that let's take chapters 3 to 5. Let's take chapters 3 to 5. But then you have to take everything, because you start by defining who a woman is, conceptualizing woman in feminist discourse. And then when you go to chapter 2, you talk about feminist scholarship and the politics of language in Africa. And because it is a book that is directly relevant to feminist philosophy of language, that's why you can't take chapter 2 away. So in short, you have to put everything together, pick all those things. But like I said, the chapter I find most interesting is between Proverbs and Proverbial. If we go on with all of that, bring all the Proverbs, not only Proverbs, sayings, wise sayings, and so on. Most of them are derogatory in nature, and they do not give a picture of a woman. Most of them give a misogynist picture of a woman. They will tell you that a woman does not have go. This is what you call, in other words, a woman cannot keep secrets. Yes, that a woman cannot keep secrets. And there are some men that you can't tell them anything. They gossip. That's their major. It's not only women that gossip. It's also men also do that. And when we know what to do with those proverbs by going post-proverbial, and then we push them into space, we populate them, then we are more or less correcting the wrongs by replacing the right with the wrong. And that's why I really like that chapter 4. Any other comments? We are 2 minutes behind. We are 2 minutes. Yeah, so we need to round up now. And in rounding up, I want to sincerely appreciate the organizers of the Lagos Studies Association Conference for putting up the author respondent session of LSA. The session is very rich, very illuminating, and I want to thank the discussants, Leye Komolafe. In actual fact, I thought he was going to say that I taught him, but since I taught your lecturers, I taught you. I'm the grandmother. I'm your grandmother. And I want to, I'm actually waiting for Dr. Oyeko to openly applaud me. And I thank Dr. Omotosho for calling me a grandma. And that's why I'm the one that is most qualified to sit down here today as the chair of this panel, because I'm the mother of doctors and professors and grandmother. And I want to appreciate you all for what you have done, from Gama to Oyeko, to Ipadiola, to Komolafe, and to all those who ask questions. In fact, for this discussant, I discovered that they actually read the book and they brought out the best in the book. And one other thing that we try to put forward when we are teaching philosophy, or what philosophy teaches us, is constructive feedback. And all the discussants today demonstrated constructive feedback. And even those who gave those comments, I mean, you can hear the author saying that she's having goosebumps.
Goosebumps.
Yes. And then to know that this book is so important, that it's so relevant, that we're already thinking of, in fact, I'm already thinking of how to incorporate this book into my gender philosophy class, to prove to them that it's not only that we are discussing gender philosophy and saying that we females should be equal to the males, and females should no longer be subjugated, they should no longer be, we should no longer use derogatory words against them. But so what do we do? And this is one of those things that this book has done, telling us what next, taking us into the future. And I want to, and all the discussants, you've been wonderful, very good, very nice. I want to wish you all the best in all your endeavors, in your academic career, and to pray that the Almighty God will continue to keep and bless each and every one of us. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you so much, man. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Auntie, thank you for this good book.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I mean, I can't even express my gratitude enough. Thank you so much. This has been really fulfilling for me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to all our participants, God bless you. Thank you for your contributions and for making this possible. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Our time is up. Bye. Bye.